Have you ever thought about something so much that, somehow, thinking about it more only made everything worse? A relationship, a decision, your work, even your own life. You keep analyzing, replaying, trying to understand, trying to get it right. And somehow, the harder you try to figure it out, the less clear everything becomes. I know that feeling. I've spent a lot of time believing that if I just thought about something long enough, I could finally control the outcome. If I analyzed the conversation one more time, I'd understand what they really meant. If I considered every possible outcome, I wouldn't make the wrong decision. If I worked harder, focused harder, tried harder, eventually things would move. And for a long time, I thought that was intelligence. I thought it meant I cared. I thought it meant I was being responsible. I didn't realize how much of it was exhaustion. There is a particular kind of exhaustion I know well. Not the exhaustion of having done too much, the exhaustion of having pushed hard and arrived nowhere. I felt it in relationships where I tried harder and harder to make something work, and somehow the trying itself seemed to make everything tighter. I've felt it in work, where the more intensely I tried to focus, the more elusive the answer became. I've felt it in my own mind. Those nights when I spent hours trying to figure something out, and then the answer arrived the next morning while I was in the shower. Not because I suddenly became smarter, because I had stopped trying to force it. And this is where things get interesting. What if the problem isn't that you're thinking too little? What if sometimes you're thinking in a way that makes it harder for your brain to see what is actually there? More than a century ago, psychologists Robert Yerkes and John Dodson studied the relationship between arousal and performance. Their original experiment wasn't about modern productivity or women trying to have everything under control, but their work became associated with an important principle. The relationship between activation and performance isn't simply more pressure equals better performance. Some activation can help. A little urgency can sharpen attention. A certain amount of pressure can help you focus. But beyond a certain point, more activation can begin to interfere with performance, particularly when the task becomes difficult or complex. And think about what that means for overthinking. If you're trying to solve something simple, pressure might help. But if you're trying to understand a complicated relationship, make a difficult decision. Create something original. Or solve a problem you've never solved before. More internal pressure doesn't necessarily give your brain more power. Sometimes it gives your brain less room, less flexibility, less ability to notice connections, less ability to consider another possibility. And this is where I think a lot of women get trapped. Not because they're incapable of effort, because they've become exceptionally good at producing it. They've learned that urgency feels productive, that tension feels serious, that discomfort means they're committed, that if they're not slightly overwhelmed by what they're doing, they must not be doing enough. So they turn the internal volume up. More pressure, more checking, more analyzing, more trying, until the very thing they're using to create progress begins interfering with their ability to see what progress actually requires. You can be working harder, while becoming less capable of seeing clearly. And neuroscience gives us another piece of the puzzle. Neuroscientist Mark Jung-Beeman and his colleagues studied what happens in the brain when people experience genuine insight, that moment when an answer suddenly seems to appear. And what they found was fascinating. Insight doesn't seem to arrive during the kind of intense, tightly controlled focus we usually associate with solving a problem. It happens alongside something closer to relaxed attention, a moment when the mind isn't forcing one particular answer, it's allowing connections that weren't obvious before to become visible. And if you've ever had an answer arrive in the shower, on a walk, while driving, or doing something completely unrelated to the problem, you already know what this feels like. You weren't solving the problem, and then suddenly, you were. That doesn't mean your brain wasn't working. It means conscious effort isn't the only form of mental work. Sometimes your mind needs space to reorganize what you've already been carrying. And this matters because there is a huge difference between asterisk, asterisk, effort, asterisk, asterisk, and asterisk, asterisk, control, asterisk, control, asterisk. I didn't understand that for a long time. I thought if I cared about something, I needed to stay mentally attached to it. If I was making a decision, I needed to keep analyzing it. If I cared about someone, I needed to keep checking the relationship. If I wanted something to work, I needed to keep monitoring whether it was working. I confused attention with control, and those aren't the same thing. You can care deeply about something without constantly trying to control its outcome. You can work seriously without constantly checking whether the work is succeeding. You can love someone without mentally rehearsing every possible way the relationship could go wrong. And sometimes the exhausting part isn't the thing you're doing. It's the amount of attention you're spending trying to make sure the thing goes the way you need it to go. Think about how much energy that takes. You don't just have the event itself. You have the event plus your interpretation of the event, plus your prediction of what happens next, plus your attempt to prevent the thing you don't want, plus your attempt to produce the thing you do want. Suddenly, you're not simply living through something. You're managing it. All the time. and management can become its own form of tension. But there's another layer. Sometimes overthinking isn't really about finding an answer. It's about avoiding the feeling of not knowing. That was a difficult one for me. Because thinking feels productive. It feels like you're doing something. You're moving through possibilities. You're preparing. You're protecting yourself. But sometimes the mind keeps thinking because uncertainty feels more uncomfortable than exhaustion. So you keep going. One more possibility. One more scenario. One more explanation. One more conversation you imagine having. And eventually, you're no longer trying to understand the situation. You're trying to create a version of the future where you cannot be surprised. But you can't think your way into complete certainty. And the attempt can consume an extraordinary amount of attention. This is why overthinking can feel so exhausting even when you've barely moved your body. Your mind has been working, constantly. And then there's the part that surprised me most. Sometimes effort isn't just something we do. It becomes part of who we think we are. You know the identity. I'm the one who works hard. I'm the one who doesn't quit. I'm the one who figures it out. I'm the one who can handle it. I'm the one who keeps going. Those sound like strengths, and they can be. But what happens when one of those strengths becomes a rule? What happens when I don't give up? Quietly becomes, I am not allowed to stop. What happens when I work hard becomes, if this feels easy, I'm probably not doing enough. What happens when I can handle anything? Becomes, I shouldn't need help. Now, effort isn't just helping you reach the goal, it's protecting an identity. And that's where things get complicated. Because changing the way you try can suddenly feel like changing who you are. Imagine you've spent years believing that your ability to endure is one of your greatest qualities. And then someone tells you, maybe you don't need to endure this. Your mind may not experience that as freedom. It might experience it as a threat. Because if you stop pushing, who are you? If you stop proving that you can handle it, what remains? If you stop fighting for something, does that mean you didn't care? And this is where some women can get stuck for years. They aren't only afraid of losing the thing. They're afraid that changing their strategy means admitting that all the effort they've already invested was somehow wasted. So they keep going. Not because the strategy is working, because stopping would force them to consider that the strategy itself may have been the problem. And there's something else I want you to notice. The more effort you've invested in something, the harder it can become to question the way you're pursuing it. Because now you're not only protecting the goal, you're protecting the meaning of all that effort. You don't want to believe those late nights were unnecessary. You don't want to believe all that worrying didn't make the relationship safer. You don't want to believe that maybe the answer wasn't another conversation, or another explanation, or another attempt to make someone understand. You want the effort to mean something, so you give it more. And sometimes the most difficult thing to let go of isn't the goal. It's the identity you built around pursuing it. Think about that. Maybe you've been calling yourself persistent. When some part of you is terrified of stopping, maybe you've been calling yourself passionate. When some part of you has learned that peace feels suspicious, maybe you've been calling yourself responsible. When what you're actually doing is carrying things that were never entirely yours to carry. And I'm not saying this to take strength away from you. Quite the opposite. There is a form of strength that doesn't require you to constantly prove that you're strong. There is effort that comes from commitment, and there is effort that comes from fear. Fear of failure, fear of uncertainty, fear of disappointing someone, fear of finding out that the thing you wanted isn't actually what you want anymore, and from the outside, they can look exactly the same. So how do you tell the difference? This is the question I keep coming back to. Not, am I working hard enough? But, what is the quality of the effort I'm making? Because engaged effort feels different from strained effort. When you're engaged, there's still room for information. You can notice something isn't working and change direction. You can hear yourself think. You can respond to what is actually happening. But when you're straining, the goal can become so important that reality itself starts becoming an inconvenience. You've already decided what has to happen. So every piece of information that says otherwise feels like an obstacle. And now you're not working with reality. You're working against it. That's what I mean by working against yourself. Not that you're sabotaging yourself. Not that you're secretly your own enemy. Something much more subtle. You're putting so much force into getting the outcome you want that you're losing access to the information that might tell you how to get there. And sometimes the thing that needs to change isn't the amount of effort. It's the amount of resistance inside the effort. I've noticed this in my own life in ways that are almost embarrassingly simple. The conversations I managed the most carefully were often the ones where I said the least of what was actually true. The decisions I analyzed endlessly often became clearer the moment I stopped demanding certainty from them. The work I tried to force into existence often improved when I walked away long enough to let my mind come back differently. And the relationships I tried hardest to control were often the relationships where I felt least like myself. That doesn't mean the answer is always to walk away. It doesn't mean effort is bad. It doesn't mean everything should feel easy. Some things are hard because they're important. Some things require discipline. Some things require you to stay when every part of you wants to escape. But difficulty and resistance are not synonyms. That's the distinction. Something can be difficult. And the relationships I tried hardest to control were often the relationships where I felt least like myself. That doesn't mean the answer is always to walk away. It doesn't mean effort is bad. It doesn't mean everything should feel easy. Some things are hard because they're important. Some things require discipline. Some things require you to stay when every part of you wants to escape. But difficulty and resistance are not synonyms. That's the distinction. Something can be difficult. Without you fighting yourself through every second of it, you can work hard and still feel spacious. You can care deeply and still be calm. You can be intensely committed without being internally clenched around the outcome. And maybe that's what I had misunderstood about ease. I thought ease meant I wasn't trying hard enough. Now, I think sometimes ease is what effort feels like when it isn't fighting itself. So, let me ask you something. Where in your life are you producing a tremendous amount of effort, but very little movement? Not where you're busy. Where you're straining, where you keep pushing the same door. Keep explaining, keep checking, keep rehearsing, keep proving, keep trying to make something happen through force. And then ask yourself something slightly more uncomfortable. What would happen if you stopped trying to control the exact way this has to unfold? Not stopped caring, not abandoned the goal. Just loosened your grip enough to see what is actually happening. Because sometimes the next step becomes visible only after you stop demanding that the previous one work. And that is not giving up. That's information. That's your mind updating its strategy. Maybe you've been taught to interpret changing direction as weakness. But changing direction can be what intelligence looks like after new information arrives. Maybe you've been taught that stopping means failure. But sometimes stopping is the first moment you can actually hear yourself. Maybe you've been taught that if you really want something, you have to fight for it. But sometimes fighting for something and moving towards something are two completely different experiences. And your body may already know which one you're in. You can feel it. The difference between effort and strain, between focus and fixation, between commitment and control, between caring about an outcome and needing the outcome to prove something about you. And maybe this is the part I want you to remember. You don't have to become less ambitious. You don't have to become passive. You don't have to stop caring. You don't have to turn into someone who just lets life happen. The goal isn't less effort. The goal is less unnecessary resistance inside the effort. Because there is a version of you that can work hard without fighting yourself. A version that can change direction without calling it failure. A version that can pause without believing she's falling behind. A version that can let an answer arrive instead of demanding that she manufacture it. And maybe you've been capable of that version for much longer than you think. You just learned to recognize strain more icily than alignment. So the next time you catch yourself pushing harder, pause for a moment, not because someone told you to relax, not because effort is bad, but because there is a question worth asking before you add more force. Asterisk, is this actually helping me move? Asterisk. Or am I using effort to feel like I'm doing something? Because not knowing what to do feels worse. That's a very different question. And sometimes the answer will be, yes, this needs more work. Keep going. And sometimes the answer will be, no. I'm pushing against something that needs to be understood before it can be moved. And knowing the difference, that's a kind of intelligence too. Maybe the thing you've been forcing so hard to move doesn't need more force. Maybe it needs more clarity. Maybe it needs a different strategy. Maybe it needs you to stop trying to control what cannot be controlled. Or maybe it needs you to stop fighting yourself long enough to notice that you've already been moving, just not in the direction you thought. I've spent a long time believing that if something mattered enough, I had to struggle for it. Now, I think there's a more honest question. Not, how hard can I push, but what happens when I stop pushing against the thing I'm trying to move? Because sometimes the most powerful change isn't more effort. It's removing the resistance that was hiding inside it. And maybe that's why the next version of your life doesn't require you to become stronger. Maybe it requires you to stop using your strength against yourself. The thing you've been forcing so hard to move, it may not need more force. It may need a different quality of hand. Maybe you're not failing. Maybe you've simply been trying to solve everything with the same tool, more effort. And sometimes the mind doesn't need more force. It needs room. If this reached you in some way, stay close. Subscribe. We're in this together.